Today, we're going to repaste the eBay 3070 from several weeks ago and see if it's worth the time repasting a GPU, especially a GPU that you picked up off eBay. Stay tuned. So, last week I showed you the difference between overclocking or undervolting a GPU using this 3070. In that video, I noticed that the GPU temperatures were kind of high. However, I'm used to running a water-cooled 3060 that never gets above the 50s. So it may be totally normal and I'm just not used to a GPU running that hot. But also, we got this GPU off of eBay and have no idea what its history has been. As far as I know, it could have been used as a mining GPU. It was very clean, but that doesn't mean that the guy I bought it from didn't just clean it before I bought it. So today we're gonna tear it down and repaste it and see if that helps our temperatures at all or find out if it's a colossal waste of time. But first, I gotta pay some bills. So check out today's sponsor. Are you still running Windows 11 unactivated because the license just costs too much? Then you should check out today's sponsor, VIP-SCDKey, where you can get a valid Windows 11 license for around $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark and actually be able to change your desktop background with a valid license for Windows 11. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 11 license key. During checkout, use the code CyberCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 11 and click the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark. And check out the description for deals on not just Windows, but Office too. Now, on with the video. So most people agree that thermal paste on a GPU should last between 3 to 5 years. And this RTX 3070 was released in October of 2020. So, since the warranty tag is unmolested, it means that the thermal paste is about 4.5 years old on this GPU. Now, obviously this time frame is just going to depend on how many heating and cooling cycles the GPU has had. As far as I know, this thing sat in a box in the back of Newegg for 2 years. But considering the fact that it was released during the GPU shortage of 2020, I highly doubt that. And like I said before, this GPU could have been used to mine cryptocurrency. Being it was released in October of 2020, that is actually very likely. Because, unfortunately, that's where most GPUs went. So, since I don't know the history of this card, it's probably best just to replace the thermal paste on it. Especially since, even under the best of circumstances, it's probably due to be repasted anyway. Because here's the thing, there's several reasons why thermal paste breaks down over time. One problem is a process called pump out. It sounds kind of dirty, but it's not. The way this process works is through numerous heating and cooling cycles of varying workloads, the thermal paste will expand and contract. And due to the pressure that the heatsink is attached to the die, it can push out from between the heatsink and die during the expansion and then be left outside of the die once the contraction takes place. This is unfortunately unavoidable with liquid thermal pastes, and over a period of time can leave less thermal paste between the heatsink and die, causing less efficient transfer of heat. And this can also cause cracking to take effect, creating voids between certain portions of the die that, no thermal paste is contacting at all, causing your hotspot to go up. Another problem is due to the heating and cooling cycles, the liquid compounds within the thermal paste itself can evaporate and causing the thermal paste to dry out. This can lead to thermal paste turning into more of a dry powdery substance that doesn't transfer heat well at all. Another problem is that thermal paste is made up of tons of different compounds like zinc oxide, aluminum, ceramic particles, and in some cases even metals like silver. Due to high temperatures, these compounds can oxidize or even break down at kind of a molecular level or a chemical level. This obviously can affect the thermal conductivity, but it can also affect or at least make it less effective at filling those microscopic gaps between the core and the heatsink. Now, all of these issues will depend on the quality of thermal paste that you use. Higher quality thermal paste will suffer from these problems less than lower quality thermal paste will. And as you might guess, GPU manufacturers don't always use the highest quality thermal paste available. but it depends on the GPU. EVGA usually uses pretty good thermal paste. So now it's time to tear this thing down and replace the thermal paste, but it's not as hard as you would think. You just have to kind of be careful and really pay attention to what you're doing. One of the first things I recommend is getting a good toolkit. The iFixit toolkit, this isn't sponsored, but it's an awesome toolkit. It's about 75 bucks and it's well worth every penny. I use this thing constantly and it's definitely paid for itself over time. So what we're gonna need to do is, if you flip the card over, on the back of the card, you're essentially gonna need to remove all of these screws right here that hold the back panel on first. And we're gonna go ahead and start getting on that right now. So to remove these, you essentially just go over to the screw, just like you would remove any screw, and just pull it out. And go ahead and set these things down in a place where you're not gonna lose them. And on this card right here, I'm pretty sure most of these screws are the same size, but what I like to do is separate different size screws so they don't go into the wrong hole. And if you want, you can actually lay the screws out in a way that kind of matches the GPU itself. And you're gonna have to go through the warranty void sticker here. If you're working on an EVGA card, these front screws that actually come right against the front panel right here actually have nuts underneath them that you have to remove. So you have to reach around and hold those nuts while you're unscrewing them from the outside, but different cards might be different. And just like I said, reach around the bottom, hold onto that nut while you turn this, and you should be able to pull the screw out and then grab the nut, just like that. And then set that aside and do the same thing to the other side. And usually you can hold these nuts with your fingers and pull them off that way. You shouldn't actually need a wrench, but if you did, it would be a very tiny wrench. So after you remove those, you should be able to remove the back panel itself. The back panel is gonna have some thermal pads on it, so you wanna make sure to be careful when you're lifting it off that you don't tear those thermal pads. And it should come off just like that. So yeah, it's not too bad. All the thermal pads came off in one piece and looks pretty good. So set this to the side, and then the last two is we have to remove these 4 screws right here. And then once those are removed, we should be able to pull the actual PCB off as well. But we also have these little connectors right here that we have to disconnect. So sometimes if you can get in here, and another reason why the iFixit toolkit is nice is you can use this little spludger right here. And you can use this to kind of pull this apart. Believe it or not, it's harder than it looks, but you have to push up on the little tab and then just kind of slide the connector off. And I got it loose there, and it looks like I can't get it all the way off because the heatsink itself's in the way. But now that it's loose, it should come off easier. So if we flip this over, we also have the fan connectors right here. And the fan connectors, same thing, we push up on this little connector, and we should be able just to slide this off. And we definitely don't want to break the fan connector itself. We want to just unplug it from the PCB, which is sometimes easier said than done. And there's one right there. And repeat the same thing with the other 2. All right, got all 4 of them off there. That wasn't easy, but got them off. Okay, so now that we got those disconnected, we can actually pull the PCB off. But to do that, we have to remove these 4 screws that are sitting right around the mounting point for the GPU itself. So let's go ahead and remove those and get the PCB pulled off. And to do that, just like before, just unscrew these screws right here and set them to the side. And I typically unscrew these in a staggered pattern, but on a GPU, I really don't think it matters. But it's the way I do it on CPUs, so I kind of just habit forming, I guess. So once that's off, then you just kind of just pull it apart. However, sometimes this thing is stuck on here really good. You also have to make sure that there's no screws in the back right here, and I don't believe there is. No, I think we're good there. Yeah, we're good there. So essentially, all we have to do is just pull this apart, which, like I said, sometimes can be easier said than done. Sometimes they're really tight, and a lot of times you don't really want to just yank on them because definitely you don't want to break the PCB. But in other times, it can just be something that you're just going to have to mess with for a little bit. And there we go. So that wasn't too bad, I guess. But once we lay this to the side right here, as you can see, it looks like our thermal pads themselves survived. And if they did, then that's okay. If your thermal pads end up breaking, then you're probably going to want to change them. But these ones here look like they're in really good condition, so I'm going to leave them be and I'm not going to change them. But what we're going to do now is, now that we have everything apart, we have to clean the actual heatsink compound off of the GPU, replace it, and put this thing back together. And while this thing's apart, as you can see, there's quite a bit of dust and dirt inside of here. So you can see that this thing has been around for a while. So we're gonna go ahead and clean all that up and get this thing put back together. So the first thing we wanna do is go ahead and remove the heatsink compound itself. Now what I wanna do is I'm gonna take a plastic spudger here just to kind of look at the compound. And as you can see, the compound, yeah, it's pretty hard. It's nowhere near as soft and pliable as new heatsink paste is. It's definitely has some miles on it, but it's not that bad. If we look at it from the actual heatsink itself, as you can see, you see how it kind of peels off like that? It's definitely hardened over time from the different, heating and cooling cycles and whatnot. And for the most part, it does look shot. So it is a good thing that we're taking this apart and replacing it, because we should be able to get pretty good temperature gains off of this. So typically you shouldn't be able to scrape heatsink compound off like this, because normally it's liquefied. So doing this, it just kind of makes a mess and it just spreads it around. But clearly this stuff has dried enough to where it's just scrapes off like dried paint. So at this point, it's a good idea to use some isopropyl alcohol to clean off the heatsink and the GPU cooler itself. Now, these are the only Q-tips I could find. Normally, I like using the more standard Q-tips, but these will work as well. But what I typically do is just take my alcohol, pour it into the cap from the bottle, and then use the cap to soak the actual Q-tip itself. And then you take the Q-tip and then just wipe down the surface just like this, just to get it clean. And do the same on the GPU itself. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of get around the edges of the die right here. You just want to be really careful not to damage any of these little components that are sitting on the edge right there. And this stuff, it looks like these are so dry that the compound doesn't want to come off. So I just use the tip of this little spudger right here and just kind of carefully loosen all this up all the way around. And there we go. And then just use a regular rag to dry it off. And again, you just want to make sure when you're doing this not to damage any of the components around the GPU die itself. And then also dry off the heatsink itself. And then we can go ahead and put some more thermal paste on here. You just want to make sure it's really clean. Make sure to get all of the old thermal paste off of it before you add new stuff on there. In fact, this one still looks like it has a little bit of dried up stuff. You'd think the alcohol would have broken that down enough to where it would have come off, but just take your time, clean it real well, and then once you're happy with it, we can move on to the next step. And that step is adding some thermal paste. Now, when you use thermal paste, I would definitely, since it's so hard to get a GPU apart, definitely get yourself some good thermal paste. I use Thermal Grizzly. It works really well, and it should work fine for this GPU. So let me show you how to apply it. Now, of course, I have no doubt that people are going to tell me that I'm doing it wrong, and that's okay if you think so. But I do it the way that I do it, and I haven't had any issues with it. So typically, I'm going to put a little bit right into the middle of the die right here. And this GPU doesn't have a heat spreader, so I wouldn't recommend just leaving it that way. I would use one of these little spudger tools or these little spreader tools. Typically, they come with heatsink compound when you buy it, and use this just to essentially spread it across the die, just like you're icing a cake. And you want just a pretty smooth covering all across the GPU die. You may have to move it around a little bit, and if you need to, you can always add a little bit more if you didn't get enough. And there we go. The goal here ultimately is to get the smoothest coating that we possibly can. We don't want lumps and stuff like that. We want to just smooth coating all the way across the die. And then once we actually mount this thing together, it will push everything out and hopefully smooth it out even more. Okay, now at this point, it's time to put it all back together. Now, like I said, if for whatever reason you tore some of your thermal pads on the heatsink or the backplate, then it's a good idea to replace them. If they get torn, it's really hard to get them to fit back together the way that they were. These ones here are just kind of press fit to the way that they were in there in the first place. So these should be just fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and reassemble it with the same thermal pads that it had before. However, if you do damage a thermal pad, you can get yourself some material like this right here. These are just bulk pieces of material that you can cut out and put in place on wherever you wanted to replace the pads. Now, for whatever reason, if you damage one pad, I would probably replace all the pads that are the same size on the GPU, because you don't want to have pads that are different heights. It could make the CPU cooler mount in a kind of an awkward position and could cause the die not to get full coverage on the heatsink itself. So make sure if you replace one, then replace them all. But if you want to reuse them, then as long as they're all in good shape, it should be okay. And to put this back together is just the repeat of the disassembly. We're just going to go ahead and mount it back together. Now you want to keep an eye on your actual plugs themselves. See, what I'm doing right here is I'm holding this RGB plug right here, and when I slide it in, I'm actually sliding that RGB plug in at the same time that I'm lowering the cooler down onto it. Now you don't want to move this around too much, because obviously you want the heatsink compound to squish. You don't want it to move around and slide off the die. So you want to set it straight down and then set this down, and we can attach these 4 points right here. And those are with these screws right here that have the little spring on them. And what the purpose of the spring is these screws are meant to screw down all the way. So there is no different tightening. You just screw them down until they don't turn anymore. Obviously, you don't need to take a torque wrench out on them. I mean, it's a computer, so you want to tighten them snug, but you don't want to strip the screws, obviously. But the purpose of these are to screw all the way down, and then the spring itself is what adds tension to the PCB, kind of pushing the PCB down onto the heatsink itself. And then, as always, I like to install these in a crosshatch pattern. So I started here, then here, then here, then here. So you want to go across to get even pressure. You don't want the PCB to go down crooked over the GPU, because you could crack the GPU, and that would be very bad. All right, now that we got those 4 screws on, now we got to install the back plate, and you want to go ahead and set this down over the top, just like this, and then reattach our screws just like we took them off. And just remember, on this one right here, we do have these front screws that require these little nuts right here. So putting them on should just be the reverse of the removal. However, you do have to hold the little nut underneath while you put it on. So it can kind of be a little complicated. So essentially put it in your finger just like that, and then hold it underneath as you run the screw down, and then kind of just line the nut up with the screw and tighten it down. Now these don't have to be super tight. They just have to be tight enough. And as long as you have them to where they won't turn out by themselves, then you should be fine. But like I said, you just hold the screw in your finger just like that, right underneath. This one you're gonna have to go closer to the tip, just like that. And then, yeah, this one's gonna be a little bit harder. All right, there we go. That was a little complicated, but it went in, obviously. And now we just have a couple more here, and we can get this thing reinstalled into the system and see, hopefully, if this thermal paste actually helped to improve our temperatures. Because if it didn't, this really would be a colossal waste of time. Okay, so the last thing we do once we have all the screws in place is to flip this around and make sure, I'm gonna make sure the RGB is plugged in, just like that. And then flip this around and plug in all your fans. Now, luckily on EVGA, the fan connectors are all color-coded to the PCB. So you just line them up and push them in place, and they should work. just like that. So now that we have the thermal paste replaced, I went ahead and did all of the baseline testing prior to replacing the thermal paste, and then repeated that testing with the new thermal paste installed. Now, during the testing, I locked the GPU fans at 75% to avoid the GPU itself from changing the fan speed and invalidating our tests. Because if the temperature's lower, then the GPU is going to lower its fan speeds, giving us a higher overall average temperature. And all this testing was done in 3D Mark using the Speedway stress test. So it would use both the CUDA cores and the RT cores in order to heat the core up as much as possible. So let's see how it did. When it comes to performance, repasting definitely wasn't a colossal waste of time. As you can see here from the chart, we weren't thermal throttling prior to repasting, but our average core temperature was around 74.7 Celsius with a max core temperature of 80 Celsius. Once repasting the GPU, we got an average core temperature of 65.5 with a max core temperature of 71.1. This gave us a decrease in core temperature of around 10 Celsius. Now, once flipping over to hotspot temperature, the story was pretty close to the same. Before repasting, we got an average hotspot temperature of 86.6 and a max hotspot of 92.5. Once repasting, we got an average hotspot temperature of 77.1 with a max hotspot of 82.6. This again was about a 10 Celsius drop in our hotspot temperature. But what does this translate into actual performance? Well, quite a bit actually. Before repasting, we got an average core clock of 1,788 megahertz with a max of 1,980 megahertz. Once repasting, we got an average core clock of 1827 and a max of 2010. That's an increase of almost 40 megahertz in our average and 30 megahertz in our max boost clock. And as you can see from the chart on the screen, our boost clock started pretty close to the same, but was able to maintain its clocks more consistently throughout the entire run. So, is it worth repasting your GPU? Well, it's kind of hard to answer that question because not all GPUs are going to have the same results as we had here. The results I got were due to the fact that the paste on this GPU had obviously failed. However, if the paste on your GPU hasn't failed, then you're not going to see the same results as I saw. Also, repasting a GPU isn't like a CPU. It's incredibly more complex. As you can see, not only is the GPU harder to get apart, but the process of repasting is a lot more prone to failure. For instance, the segment that I just filmed showing you how to disassemble your GPU and repaste it resulted in a higher core temperature than I first had at the beginning. It wasn't until tearing the GPU down for a second time and trying a slightly different paste method that I got the lower temperatures that I showed you just now. Ultimately, though, I used this paste method by applying a line of thermal paste across the side of the die and then spreading it across the whole die in one stroke, ultimately looking like this prior to putting it back together for the second time. Also, you have the issue of thermal pads that are cooling your memory modules as well. These are highly specific. Not only do they come in varying thicknesses, but they also come in varying crush rates. Installing the wrong thermal pad can lead to either memory modules not getting enough cooling or them getting too much contact and causing the GPU die to not get good contact with the cooler. This is one of the reasons why I recommend not replacing the thermal pads unless you absolutely have to. Typically, as long as the thermal pads don't tear, they should be okay to reuse. But if you do have to replace them, then I would find out what thickness the GPU pads are that you have to use prior to taking apart your GPU so you can have those thermal pads available to you on hand just in case you need them. Oftentimes, manufacturers will share this information, and if they don't, you can usually find it on different forums online. But if you do get it from forums, then make sure you get a couple different sources for your specific make and model GPU. Ultimately though, repasting your GPU is definitely worth it if your current thermal paste has failed like ours did. And after you do that, it's probably a good idea to repaste your CPU as well. Luckily, it's nowhere near as complicated. In fact, there are even some good options for thermal pads for CPUs. If you'd like to see more about that, then check out this video right here, where I test a couple different thermal pads against traditional thermal paste. The results came out really good. There are many people that actually use thermal pads on GPUs as well, and that might be worth it. As always, you guys have a great day.